Hey YouTubers, thanks for joining me here again. This is the second part of the series Scenes and Sounds, where I attempt to sort of take a bit of a musical genre or a little sub-movement that's happened throughout the years and just have a bit of a closer look at it. I'm no historian, I just, like you guys, am fascinated with music and the culture behind music and uh, the players that are involved and the musical landscape and how it changes because of these little sub-genres that creep up and make change. This week I want to look at a band called Magma, which I'm sure you are all familiar with, but I want to look at their influence and in fact their creation of the genre and movement that we now know as Zeuhl or Zeuhl or Zeuhl or however you want to pronounce it. I've heard it pronounced all three of those ways. But Zeuhl is a fascinating little movement over in France in the early 70s. Um, and yeah, let's take a look at it. It's such a rare case that a genre and scene and movement of music can come down to one person, but in this case, it's true. We're looking at French drummer Christian Vander, who pretty much single-handedly created this concept of Zeuhl music and the Kabayan language, which he created himself. Um, I think I read somewhere that he was inspired by the death of John Coltrane and wanted to fill the void in the world that John Coltrane would leave behind once he died in '68. So in 1969, Christian Vander sets out and creates this concept band called Magma. And only 1 year later they released their debut record. The album we're talking about is this one here, entitled, well, self-titled, but eventually was reissued under the title Kabaya. Now, Kabaya refers to, I should probably slow down a little bit, but Kabaya refers to the language which, it's a fictional language which Christian Vander created himself, a musical language, less to do with semantics and more to do with sort of phonetics and the way that the words sound and how they react to music. Very specific language to Magma. It's strictly his creation. And just think about that for a second. I mean, this guy created a language, not just a sound, but an entire language, and which then the ripple effects to that creates this whole mythology around the band and the sound and the concept. His first record is a double release, and it was a concept album that explored a story of future refugees, Earthlings, fleeing Earth and finding refuge on another planet, the planet named Kabaya, where they spoke Kabayan language. In retrospect, on this record, it's really, you can hear the formation. This is a really formative record for the band. They're really discovering and exploring the genre and style for themselves, unencumbered and really sort of free. Highly influenced, as you can hear. You can hear a lot of Coltrane influence on here, as well as the neoclassical choral vocals, which become a theme throughout all of Zeuhl music. Not just Magma, but for all the other bands that sort of jump on and sort of pay homage to this sound. It's the choral sort of massive, grandiose vocals, all sung in Kabayan language, which become a real standout element to the Zeuhl sound. So surprisingly enough, this thing actually was quite a successful project for Christian Vander and his little concept. Only in France. It's amazing. But it grew into a big thing, and the band Magma grew, and the support grew, and over the next few years they released a whole slew of records with a bunch, like, I'm talking 20, 30 different people moving in and out of the band and coming in, playing their part for one record and then moving off again, coming back for 3 or 4 albums later to be part of it. The list of Magma musicians or musicians that have played on a Magma record is absolutely huge. The list is endless. So the band has had quite a big influence, I imagine, on French musicians, and well, not just French musicians, but people that have played in this scene. Yeah, it's really, really hard to identify just the impact, the size of the impact that this kind of music would have on people. Magma, the band, and the Kabayan mythology is growing to almost cult-like proportions, where there's actually a huge amount of interest and intrigue into this little culture that Christian Vander's created. Now I'm not unsure whether it was a piss take or not, but in 1972 he put this album out under a different name, but still it's Magma Musicians, and it's all Magma Musicians. The band's named Univeria Zect, the Unnamables. And this record was put out as a Zeuhl for Beginners record. That's what I mean. I'm not sure if he was taking the piss or what, but basically it's a record that's in the Zeuhl style but stripped way back for people to understand. Not for children, but for for musicians, I guess, where they look at the roots of the music and how it interacts with itself. It's actually a really great record. Nothing like Magma, in a way. I mean, it's the Magma sounds, but it's nothing like a Magma record. It's quite stripped back. It's less dark. It's more happy and sort of. It's really quite interesting, actually. But it's well worth a look anyway. The Unnamables, Univeria Zect. For me, the Magma record that is the most powerful and which most sums up the sound is this one here, Mechanic Destructive Commando, which came out in, I think, 74. This is to me, the peak of the sound, and where they really get everything right. And it was probably the most popular record as well, actually. Just a phenomenal record, and really sort of, if you can imagine, what the sound of a space opera would sound like, this is the sort of concept that we're talking about here. But this record here, and as well as this one, actually, this one follows up really nicely. But they're both, just fantastic records and well worth exploring. Magma are a huge band, and anyone that hasn't explored the sound of Magma needs to get onto that right now. Needs to. It's essential music, and I think these two records are a good place to start. Around the same period, around 1974, Christian Vander recorded this record, which is the original motion picture soundtrack for a movie by Ivan Lagrange, and it's called Tristan and Isolde. And it was the movie. It's sort of an avant-garde film based on an old Celtic story, from the 12th century or something like that. And the filmmaker. The funny story about this record is that the filmmaker actually made a really sort of small-time film years earlier, using a tape that he'd found of Magma rehearsal sessions and things like this, outtakes and stuff. And I don't know how, no one knows how Christian Vander got hold of these tapes. They've never resurfaced since. but he negotiated that he would, as long as he got to do the soundtrack for Ivan Lagrange's new film, he wouldn't sue for using his music in one of his earlier films. And that's how this came to be. It's really interesting. This is an excellent record. I mean, it's a Magma record, really, but it's much more stripped back. It's just a four-piece, as opposed to the massive sort of big production stuff that he has going on the Magma records. This is Magma stripped back, and it's just as powerful, just as hypnotic, just as trance-inducing, and just as sort of mind-blowing in a way. You know, it's really one of the best Zeuhl records, I think, this record here, and a really great example of the style. Among many other scenes and little movements that happened in France in the sort of mid to late 70s, as you probably realise, Zeuhl sort of took off, and especially with that amount of musicians that were involved, as you saw earlier, and some members becoming, increasingly dissatisfied with Christian Vander and his vision for the Zeuhl stuff, and steering more away from the jazz improvisation sort of stuff. Members left and formed their own things. One of those bands, which had sort of a parallel career to Magma in the through the early 70s through to the 80s, was this band Zeuhl. And this band was made up of the horns player Jeff Seffer, who was originally from Magma, as well as Francois Faton-Kane, who was the pianist of Magma as well. Funnily enough, a very similar style to Magma. I think less dark and less sort of dramatic. Zeuhl's style of music is a little bit more sort of understated. Zeuhl is definitely an important Zeuhl band to come out of the area, and well worth exploring some of their music. Another one that comes to mind that sort of broke away from the Magma thing for a while there is this great band here, Vidorj, which is mostly the music you're hearing on this video. Actually, comes from this record here, one of my favourite Zeuhl records, and it's true to the style, though Christian Vander doesn't play on this at all. It's got a fantastic lineup of other musicians that played in Magma at the time of its sort of peak period. Patrick Gauthier is one that comes to mind, who is an absolutely phenomenal synth and arranger and keyboard player and everything like that. But this record here, as you can hear, is just really fun, awesome record in the Zeuhl style. Patrick Gauthier's solo record. I think this is his first. I think this is the debut. Baby Godzilla is just a knockout record as well from 1981. Really worth checking out. The same players on the Vidorj record play on this. This is a little bit more of an avant-garde sort of electronic progressive rock sort of style with definitely with Zeuhl elements, though. You need to check this out as well. Later on, certainly into the later part of the 70s and into the early 80s, we've got bands who are, new bands, young people in France who are imitating, or I suppose you could say sort of inspired and influenced by the early Magma stuff, and they're now creating their own sort of second generation versions of this music, heavily inspired by Christian Vander and his concepts of Kabayan language and this sort of thing. So that's really exciting. All these new bands just sort of flower out from what Magma created, which is why we're here, which is why we're just talking about the scene. One of the bands that comes to mind is Arkaya, who they're a three-piece from France. This record came out in 1977, I think. And it was a private pressing. very few numbers were sold. Thankfully enough, it's been reissued by Papava Records. But this is an absolutely really dark sort of chamber prog, Zeulish record that is really worth checking out if you're interested in the genre and the scene. Another one that's sort of a similar vein, definitely high quality music here, is this great group. I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's pronounced Dune or Dune. Also from, I think from Belgium, maybe France, Belgium. Their first and only record, Eros, was pressed to 1,000 copies. Just was never picked up by a label. This was just a privately pressed thing, and one of the best sort of Zeuhl records around. Very very closely weaved into the style and heavily influenced with the original style. This is an absolutely brilliant record. Highly recommend it. Another band that came out at the time that were probably a little bit more talked about, and as they put out a couple of records in this style. The first of which I don't have. All these records go for a lot of money, so it's really hard to get all the ones that you want to talk about. Their second release, however, was released on cassette only, and wasn't reissued for years later. It came out in 1981, and in 2012, Zeuhl put this one out for us. It's Eschaton's Four Visions, which was a it had a mythology all on its own. This band is just one of those really fantastic dark underground sort of Zeuhl bands that really created an awe about them and a real allure. Fantastic musicians, and I think, I keep saying this, but this music is just so it's just so emotive and just so dramatic and grand in its sort of presentation. It's really impressive music. You can't put this on and ignore it, that it's there. You can't put this on and go and do another activity. It really stops you in your tracks, and you must listen. It demands your attention. Fantastic stuff, this sort of music. Their second record, probably not as strict about the Zeuhl sort of foundations. This one sort of stretches out into sort of more avant-garde jazz and a little bit of electronic stuff as well. But Fiction is a fantastic record as well. I really like this, although it's very different to the first one, or the first one I showed. Some other noteworthy albums to come out of the same scene. There was quite a lot of overlap, because at the same time France is going through this massive thing with its progressive electronic music, which is just exploding. With bands like everything that Besson Rosette were doing, and Heldon, and these kind of bands. There was a massive crossover with these artists, because this is really experimental music at its peak in France, I think. So at the same time, there's albums coming out like this one, which definitely features some Zeuhl elements in it. Bernard Zajner's Some Death Take Forever is a really great example of where Zeuhl meets sort of jazz and electronic progressive music. Fantastic record. I could probably show this in a different video as well, just because of the crossover nature of the style of music that features on here. But you'll definitely find some Zeuhl elements in this record. Another one in a similar vein is this Vortex record, which is it's their second album, but this and their first both have heavy inspired Zeuhl or Magma-esque qualities about them. I wouldn't strictly say they're a avant-garde jazz fusion band. There's progressive and neoclassical elements to the music that really makes it stand out and really makes it unique. Certainly with this album, There are this is a Zeuhl record, no doubt about it. Potemkin's Fetus is a Zeuhl record, a great example of the style. With the Kobayan vocals, or the improvised sort of choral vocals, female vocals. That usually that's a really strong element of the Zeuhl style as well. The slow burning builds, the dramatic sort of stop-start nature of the music. Yeah, this has got it all. This is a fantastic album, Potemkin. And then we venture into the mid-80s, where all of a sudden a band pops up that has taken the Magma template, if you will, and extended on that in a really original way. It's not just a homage. This is these guys really sort of carried the flame. If you want to look at it that way, sort of Magma passed the torch to these guys in some ways when it comes to the sounds that they create on this record. The band's called Shub Nagurath, and this is their second album, which was a concept album based on the novel H.P. Lovecraft, and it's one of the most breathtaking Zeuhl records you're going to listen to. Dark again, grandiose, dramatic, high intensity, big builds. There's four tracks on the whole thing, and yeah, just brilliant record from start to finish. Certainly by the late 80s, this style of music was, it had had its peak, and it had come down again, and it wasn't really that well talked about, apart from really underground followers and stuff like this. But this last record that I'll mention came out in 1999 from an Italian band, surprisingly. The record's called Ritual Alieno by the band Universal Totem Orchestra. And this is a sort of a blend of symphonic progressive music, modern style symphonic prog, in the Italian sort of tradition, meets Zeuhl. It has the Zeuhl vocal and the Zeuhl build-ups, and yeah, it's a beautiful record. So there you have it. That's sort of a bit of a look at a very brief look at the Zeuhl style, and some of the albums that are worth checking out. There's some more too, which I don't have, and some names that are worth checking out. The Zeuhl style became sort of quite popular in the 90s in Tokyo, in Japan. Koenji Hayakai and a band called Ruins were big in Japan at that time, who followed the tradition of the Zeuhl sounds. There was also another act, I think they're called Zebko Shot or Zebko Shot or something, from France, really worth checking out, which I've heard but haven't actually got anything here to show you guys. But there's other stuff too out there that's really worth checking out. Magma is where it all began, and I think that for those, if nothing else, go out and check out some Magma if you haven't heard any. In the same way that Can is important to krautrock and experimental rock, in the same way that Pink Floyd is important to progressive rock, in the same way that the Beatles are important to pop rock, Magma are very important to French progressive avant prog and Zeuhl and these kind of acts. That was so forward thinking with their creations and their music. We're talking about, this band formed in 1969, 1970. So, that's just mind-blowing that music like this could be conceived of at that time. Thanks so much for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe if you like what you see. And join me again for the next Scenes and Sounds installment. Hope you enjoy. Cheers, VC.